Welcome to Shocking Family Secrets Tales, the sanctuary for stories that unravel the deepest truths hidden within families. Now, before we dive into today's shocking story, I have one very important request. If you're ready to embark on a journey into the darkest corners of family dynamics, to uncover secrets and truths that will leave you breathless, then make sure you're a part of our community. Please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. The first sound I ever knew was not a lullaby, but the quiet, imposing tick of the grandfather clock in the hall of our mansion. It was a sound that measured not just time, but a certain quality of existence, one of polished surfaces, hushed voices, and unspoken expectations. My name is Elara, and from my earliest, foggiest memories, I knew I was adopted. It was not a secret. It was a founding myth, carefully curated and delivered with the precision of a practiced speech. My parents, Richard and Caroline Sterling, presented my arrival into their lives as an event of near-biblical significance. "We searched the world, my dear," my mother would say, her voice a soft, melodic instrument she used with conscious effort. "And when we saw you, we knew. We chose you. You were the most special child." This narrative was my bedrock, my crown. In a world of old money and older family names, I was the chosen heir, the living testament to my parents' magnanimity and modern outlook. It wasn't a mark of difference, it was my divine right. Our home was a showcase of restrained opulence. It wasn't just large, it was acoustically deadened by thick Persian rugs that swallowed footsteps and whispers alike. The air always carried the faint, clean scent of lemon polish and fresh-cut calla lilies. My room wasn't a bedroom. It was a suite in the south wing, a sleeping area, a private study, a sitting room, and a balcony that overlooked gardens so manicured they looked painted. It was a gilded cage, but for the longest time, I was too enchanted by the sparkle of the gold to notice the bars, or the fact that the door was always, in subtle ways, closed. My father's love was a transactional thing, expressed in the rustle of $100 bills, the platinum credit card with my name on it, and the impeccable pedigree of the private schools I attended. His affection was in the delegation of my needs. "My assistant will handle it," was his mantra for everything from a skinned knee to a broken heart. He was a man built of spreadsheets and stock portfolios, and I eventually understood, one of his more interesting long-term investments. My mother's love was an aesthetic. It was expressed through the meticulous planning of my birthday parties, which were less celebrations and more social statements. The guest list was scrutinized for social capital, the theme was chosen for its photogenic qualities, and my dress was always designer, always perfect, and always just a little too stiff for a child to play in. I was her greatest philanthropic project, a living, breathing extension of her impeccable taste and generous spirit. I was to be polished, presented, and perfect. I learned the rules of this world, quickly. Speak when spoken to. Be seen, not heard, unless your words are charming and intelligent. Never show excessive emotion. Joy was undignified, sadness was weakness, and anger was simply not tolerated. I became a small, well-dressed diplomat in my own home, negotiating for scraps of genuine affection with the currency of good behavior and excellent report cards. 4 years, I believe the fairy tale. I was the chosen one, the special girl who had been rescued from an obscure, unfortunate fate and placed in a palace. I clung to the story, repeating it to myself during the long, lonely evenings when I ate dinner with my parents in the cavernous dining room, the only sounds the delicate clinking of silver on fine china and the endless, ticking clock. But palaces are cold, and gold is a metal that doesn't warm to the touch. The first chill of doubt came not as a shock, but as a slow, creeping frost. I was around 12, I think, when I started to notice the looks that passed between my parents when I scored top marks in school, a look of satisfaction, not pride. The way my mother would subtly reposition me for family photographs, her hands on my shoulders steering me to the periphery, while my cousins were clustered at the center. The way my father would talk about the Sterling legacy and ensuring the bloodline thrives, his eyes sliding over me as if I were a piece of furniture. The gilded cage was still beautiful, but I had begun to feel its confines. I started to understand that chosen was a conditional term. It meant chosen to perform, chosen to represent, chosen to fulfill a role. I wasn't sure what would happen if I ever stopped being special, if I ever stepped out of the perfect box they had built for me. A low-grade anxiety became my constant companion, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, this beautiful life wasn't built on a foundation of love, but on something far more fragile. The fairy tale was starting to show its cracks, and I was desperately trying to ignore them, terrified of what I might see if I looked too closely. The clock kept ticking, measuring the passage of my childhood in that beautiful, silent house, a countdown to a moment I didn't yet know was coming. The first major fracture in my curated reality didn't appear with a dramatic crash. It was a hairline crack, so fine it was almost invisible, but it ran deep, threatening the entire structure. I was 16, and my cousin Chloe, my father's sister's daughter, was getting married. It was the social event of the season, held at the most exclusive country club in the state. The air itself was thick with the scent of money, gardenias, and unspoken social contracts. 4 weeks, my mother had been involved in the planning. My own dress was a subject of intense discussion. We finally settled on a floor-length gown of deep emerald green velvet. "It complements your complexion," my mother had declared, her head tilted as she assessed me like a piece of art. "It looks expensive." That was the highest praise. The night of the wedding, as I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my suite, I actually felt a flicker of belonging. The dress was beautiful. I felt sophisticated, and for a moment, I could believe I was a seamless thread in the rich, Sterling family tapestry. The ceremony was a blur of organ music and solemn vows. The reception, however, was where the real drama unfolded. The hall was a vision of white and gold, with 1,000 twinkling lights reflecting off crystal glasses. A band played soft jazz. I floated through the crowd on a cloud of, accepting compliments with a practiced smile. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As the guests were ushered to their tables for dinner, I naturally gravitated towards the main family table. It was a grand, round fortress of white linen, situated centrally under a dazzling chandelier. It was laden with silverware and crystal, and the centerpiece was a sprawling, fragrant masterpiece of orchids and roses. This was where the family sat. My family. I was about to pull out one of the heavy, upholstered chairs when a hand closed around my wrist. The grip was firm, cool, and unyielding. It was my mother's. Her smile was a perfect, tight curve, a masterpiece of facial control that didn't reach her eyes, which were as sharp and cold as shards of glass. "No, not there, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice a low, discreet whisper meant only for my ears, yet it seemed to echo in the sudden silence of my mind. I froze, confused. "But this is the family table," I whispered back, my voice barely audible. "Your seat is over there," she said, her grip tightening slightly as she gave a subtle, dismissive nod towards the back of the hall. My eyes followed her gesture to a smaller, rectangular table positioned close to the swinging doors of the kitchen. The B table, the table for distant cousins, college friends with no social standing, and plus ones who didn't merit a place in the inner circle. I could already see the steam from the kitchen doors occasionally drifting over that table. The air left my lungs in a silent whoosh. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. My face grew hot with a sudden, searing flush of shame. I looked past my mother to my father, a silent plea for intervention. But he was studiously examining the wine label, engaged in a loud, jovial conversation with my uncle, his back partially turned to me. His avoidance was a confirmation louder than any words. He had seen. He knew. And he was complicit. The message was delivered with surgical precision. I was with a family, but I was not of the family. In the hierarchy of blood and name, I was a subordinate, an accessory, not a core member. "Go on now," my mother said, her smile never wavering as she gave my wrist a final, patting squeeze before releasing it, as if shooing away a mildly inconvenient pet. Numbly, I turned and walked towards the back of the room. The emerald velvet, which moments before had felt like a royal robe, now felt like a clown's costume, garish and ridiculous. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some curious, some pitying, some undoubtedly smug. The walk to that table felt like a mile-long march of shame. I took a seat between Chloe's college roommate, who was loudly complaining about the lack of a vegan option, and a second cousin twice removed I'd met only once before. The conversation at the table was stilted and generic. I spent the entire evening in a state of suspended animation, pushing food around my plate, watching the main table. I watched my parents laugh with my aunts and uncles. I watched my grandparents beam at their descendants. I watched the easy, physical affection, the inside jokes, the sense of a shared history that I would never be a part of. Every burst of laughter from that central table felt like a needle in my skin. Every toast felt like a celebration from which I was explicitly excluded. The chosen one, narrative I had clung to for so long, shattered into a million pieces, revealing itself to be a beautiful, convenient lie. I hadn't been chosen for a seat at the table. I had been chosen for a seat in the corner, where I could be displayed when useful and hidden when inconvenient. That night I didn't cry. The hurt was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard, crystallizing pain. I lay in my perfect bed in my perfect room, staring at the perfect ceiling, and I understood. The foundation of my life was not rock but ice, and it was starting to crack beneath my feet. The fracture had begun, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would only get wider. The wedding incident became the ghost at every feast, the uninvited guest at every family gathering. It was the lens through which I now viewed every interaction, every word, every silence in the Sterling household. The world looked the same pristine surfaces, the same hushed elegance, but I was different. I had been given the gift of doubt, and it was a gift that poisoned everything it touched. I became an archaeologist of my own life, digging through past memories, re-excavating them with this new, painful awareness. That time I won the school science fair, my father's handshake had been brisk, his comment, "The Sterling name carries weight, good to see you upholding it." Not, "I'm proud of you," but an acknowledgement of a good brand investment. The way my mother would always rearrange the pillows on my sofa after she visited my suite, a silent correction that my personal taste was not quite up to standard. These were no longer innocent quirks, they were data points in a damning case against my place in this family. My wing of the house, once a symbol of my privileged status, transformed in my perception. It was no longer a suite, it was a designated containment zone. A beautifully appointed quarantine area where the adopted daughter could be kept, presentable but at a safe distance from the heart of the family. The doors to my parents' private studies and sitting rooms, which I had always understood were off limits, now felt like fortified borders. I started to study my parents like a foreign language I was desperate to master. My mother's hugs, which I had once craved, now felt like a carefully measured ritual. They were brief, boneless, and always initiated by her. They were a performance of maternal duty, not an overflow of affection. I noticed she never used terms of endearment like sweetie or honey, with the unthinking ease I heard from other mothers. It was always Elara, spoken with a deliberate, almost formal tone. My father was a harder text to read, but the subtext became clearer. He began talking more frequently about legacy and bloodline, especially when discussing the future of his multi-million-dollar business. "It's about preserving what our ancestors built," he'd say at dinner, his gaze sweeping past me to some distant, hypothetical future where a real Sterling heir would take the reins. I was studying art history, a subject he deemed unmonetizable. His sighs of disappointment were heavier than any shouted criticism. This targeted doubt, as I now think of it, wasn't a loud, raging storm of suspicion. It was a slow, insidious frost creeping up from the ground, freezing the roots of my sense of self. I began to question my own worth. Was I not pretty enough? Not smart enough? Not sufficiently grateful? Was there some fundamental flaw in my character? Some invisible stain that made me unlovable to them, despite all their resources and the perfect world they provided? I became a master performer. I knew my lines, my cues, my blocking. I could deliver the perfect, respectful daughter performance on command. I laughed at my father's dry jokes. I discussed interior design with my mother. I presented a united, polished front to the outside world. But inside, I was crumbling. The effort of maintaining this facade was exhausting. It was like holding my breath for years on end. I started spending more time away from home, involved in any after-school activity that would keep me out of the house. I buried myself in books, not for pleasure, but for escape. I created a rich inner world where I was the protagonist, not the supporting actor in someone else's story. My friendships at school became my lifeline, but even they were tinged with anxiety. I was terrified of inviting friends over, of them seeing the cold, performative nature of my family life and pitying me. The doubt created a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in my life. I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the next, more explicit rejection. I felt like an imposter in my own life, a fraud who would eventually be discovered and cast out. The fairy tale was well and truly dead, replaced by a psychological thriller where I was both the victim and the detective, piecing together the clues of my own alienation. By the time I was preparing for college, the frost had settled deep into my bones. The decision to choose a university on the opposite side of the country wasn't a rebellion, it was a survival instinct. It was a desperate gasp for air. I needed distance from the gilded cage, from the constant scrutiny, from the architecture of doubt that was slowly suffocating me. I applied to a single, excellent liberal arts college in California, a world away from the stifling East Coast tradition of my family. When the acceptance letter came, I felt a surge of emotion so powerful it startled me. It wasn't joy. It was relief. Profound, bone-deep relief. I was going to escape. I was going to breathe. Little did I know, the cage door would open, but the shadow of the bars would follow me for a long, long time. You are absolutely right. My apologies. I only provided the first 4 chapters. Let me continue with the remaining 6 chapters to complete the 10-chapter story as requested. The peace I had built in California felt like a beautiful, fragile bubble. I should have known it couldn't last. The call came on a Tuesday evening as I was studying for finals. Ben was beside me on the couch, quizzing me on art history terms. When my phone lit up with Mom, a cold dread, ancient and familiar, washed over me. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but years of conditioning won out. Elara, her voice was crisp, efficient, devoid of any maternal warmth. No, how are you? No, how's school? Just straight to business. Your father and I need to see you this weekend. It's important. The words were simple, but the tone was a command, a royal summons. My stomach twisted into a knot. This weekend? But I have finals starting next week. This isn't a request, she interrupted, her voice leaving no room for argument. We'll expect you for dinner on Friday. 7 o'clock sharp. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, my hand trembling slightly. Ben was watching me, his brow furrowed with concern. Everything okay? He asked. It's my parents, I said, my voice hollow. They need to see me. Do you want me to come with you? He offered immediately, his hand finding mine. I shook my head, a wave of protective affection for him washing over me. I couldn't subject him to the Sterling Inquisition, to the cold scrutiny, to the inevitable performance. No, this is something I have to do alone. The flight back east was a study in anxiety. Every bump of turbulence felt like an omen. The closer I got, the smaller I felt, the old persona of the obedient, placating daughter trying to reassert itself over the confident young woman I had become. The Uber ride from the airport to the house was a journey back in time, through increasingly manicured neighborhoods, each house a monument to wealth and silence. I stood before the familiar heavy oak door, my heart pounding. I took a deep breath, channeling the strength I had found in California, in Ben and myself. I would not let them shrink me. I walked in. The house was exactly as I had left it, a museum. The air was still, scentless. My parents weren't in the foyer to greet me. Of course not. I found them in the living room, seated side by side on the stark white sofa, a united front. They looked like they were posing for a portrait. They didn't get up. "Elara," my father said, his voice a low rumble. "Sit." He gestured to the single, high-backed armchair position directly opposite them. It was the same chair they used for business meetings, for interviews, for anyone who wasn't family. The symbolism was a deliberate, cruel reenactment of the wedding. They were establishing the hierarchy before the conversation even began. I was not on their team. I was on the other side of the table. I sat, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. My posture was perfect, back straight, a skill drilled into me since childhood. We looked at each other across an expanse of polished floor, the distance between us feeling oceanic. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. It was a psychological tactic, I realized, the silence. They were waiting for me to break, to fill the void with nervous chatter, to reveal my hand. I remained silent, matching their gaze. I would not make this easy for them. My mother finally spoke, breaking the silence with the precision of a scalpel. "We've been doing some accounting," she began, her tone that of a CFO presenting an audit. "A comprehensive review of our finances over the past 2 decades. My father nodded, his hand resting on a sleek, black folder on the coffee table. He didn't open it, just let it sit there, a dark, ominous presence. "When we brought you into our home," he continued, picking up the thread, "it was, as you can imagine, a significant undertaking. There were substantial initial costs. Legal fees, agency fees, immigration paperwork." My blood ran cold. Where was this going? This wasn't about family. This was a financial briefing. My mother leaned forward slightly. Then, of course, there were the ongoing investments. The private schools, the tutors, the extracurriculars, the medical and dental care, the clothing allowances, the vacations. She listed them off like line items on a balance sheet, her voice devoid of any sentiment. We provided a certain standard of living, one that required considerable financial planning. The targeted doubt I had lived with for years crystallized into a terrifying certainty. This wasn't a family meeting. This was a performance review for a failing investment. The black folder contained my life, quantified, commoditized. The peace I had found, the identity I had built, began to feel flimsy in the face of this cold, hard calculus. My father's fingers tapped the folder. "We believe in responsibility, Elara. In accountability. We feel it's time for you to understand the full scope of the resources that were dedicated to you." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the plush silence of the room. "It's time for you to see the ledger." He finally slid the black folder across the glass surface of the coffee table. It stopped just within my reach. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was the moment the other shoe dropped. The moment the gilded cage was finally, irrevocably, revealed to be a prison with a price tag. With a trembling hand, I reached out and opened it. The first page was a summary. A cold, clinical header. Cost of care and upbringing, Elara Sterling. Below it, my name didn't look like a name. It looked like a project code. My eyes, blurred with the disbelieving tears, scanned the document. It was an invoice, a detailed, itemized bill for my entire existence. The entries were meticulous, spanning from the year of my adoption to the present. They were grouped by category: adoption and legal initial costs, international adoption agency fees, $18,500, legal representation and immigration processing, $9,750, home study and background checks, $4,000, travel and accommodation for acquisition trip, $12,300. The word acquisition hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't a child, I was an asset. Education. Willow Creek Private Preschool, annual $32,000. Kensington Academy Elementary tuition, $150,000 total. St. Bridget's High School tuition, $120,000. Private tutors, various subjects, $45,000 estimated. SAT prep courses, $8,500. Living and maintenance. Annual clothing allowance, $60,000. Total, averaged. Orthodontics and dental work, $7,200. Psychological counseling, ages 10 to 16, $24,000. Summer camps and enrichment programs, $28,000. Extracurricular activities, piano, horseback, etc., $55,000. Lifestyle, family vacations, prorated share $45,000. Birthday and Christmas gifts, averaged annual value $15,000 total. Vehicle, Sweet 16 BMW, and insurance $52,000. Monthly allowance, ages 13 to 18, $21,600. I felt nauseous. They had monetized every aspect of my life. The piano lessons I hated, the therapist I was sent to when I seemed withdrawn, the Christmas presents, the clothes. It was all here, reduced to a number. They had kept a ledger. For 22 years, they had been mentally tallying the cost of my food, my shelter, my very presence in their world. My life, my childhood, my struggles, my joys, it was all just data in a spreadsheet. The beautiful fairy tale of being chosen had been shredded, revealing the purchase order underneath. The emotional neglect, the constant feeling of being an outsider, it all made a horrific, brutal sense now. I was a line item, a depreciating asset that hadn't provided the expected return on investment. My eyes, stinging with tears of pure, unadulterated shock, dropped to the bottom of the page. There was a subtotal, a staggering number that made my head spin. Then, a line that read, less, perceived emotional and social value provided. They had assigned a value to their own, what? Disappointment. The social capital of having a well-dressed, well-behaved adopted daughter. And then, the final line. The number that represented my net worth in their eyes. The amount they had decided I was liable for. Total due, $6,250. The number was so specific, so absurdly non-rounded, that it felt more real, more insulting than a larger, symbolic sum. It wasn't $1 million. It was $6,250. A manageable amount. A calculated insult. It was the price of a used car or a vacation. The price of my freedom, according to the Sterling accounting department. The targeted shock was absolute. It was a nuclear bomb detonating in the center of my identity. I sat there, paralyzed, the paper trembling in my hands. I looked from my father's impassive face to my mother's expectant one. They were waiting for my reaction. They had just presented me with a bill for my life, and they were waiting for me to what? Apologize. Negotiate a payment plan. The initial wave of nausea and devastation began to recede, replaced by something else. Something colder, harder, clearer. It was a wave of such profound, clarifying fury that it froze the tears in my eyes. The shock had burned away the last vestiges of doubt, of need, of that little girl's desperate hope for their love. In its place was a diamond-hard certainty. I was not their daughter. I was a business partner in a failed venture, and it was time to dissolve the partnership. The silence in the room was now of my own making. It was no longer their weapon. It was my shield, giving me time to let the cold clarity settle in my veins. I slowly, deliberately, closed the black folder. The click of the cover was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I looked at them, these two strangers who had raised me. I saw them not as parents, but as entities. A CEO and a CFO who had just delivered a termination notice. The performance was over. The obedient daughter was gone. A comprehensive review, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the tension. It's very thorough. My mother's lips tightened slightly. They had expected tears, hysterics, perhaps begging. This calm analysis was not in their script. Elara, my father began, his tone shifting to one of paternal condescension, a tool he used when a business negotiation needed a softer touch. We're not trying to be cruel. This is about responsibility, about understanding the real world. Nothing in life is free. A bitter, silent laugh bubbled up inside me. "Oh, I understand that now," I said, my gaze locking with his. "Better than you can possibly imagine." I stood up. My legs felt strong, steady. I walked away from the chair, from the designated other spot. I walked to the foyer, where I had left my purse on a marble-top console table. I could feel their confused eyes on my back. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my checkbook. It was from my personal account, the one where I deposited the money from my part-time job at the campus library. The money I had earned myself. I walked back into the living room, the checkbook in my hand. I didn't sit down. I stood before them, and for the first time, I felt like I was looking down at them. "I have reviewed the invoice," I said, my voice formal, mirroring their own businesslike tone. "And I agree. It's time to settle accounts." I flipped open the checkbook, took out a pen, and began to write. The scratch of the pen on the paper was the only sound. I filled in the date. I wrote Richard and Caroline Sterling on the payee line. And on the amount line I wrote, with deliberate, clear numbers, $6,250.00/100. I paused at the memo line. This was the most important part. This was where I would define this transaction for all of history. I didn't write for adoption costs or reimbursement. I wrote a single, powerful word: freedom. I tore the check from the book with a clean, sharp rip. I stepped forward and placed it on the coffee table, not on the folder, but directly on the gleaming glass surface, centering it between them. "There," I said, my voice ringing with a finality that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Payment in full. The debt is cleared. We are settled." The looks on their faces were priceless. It was a mixture of shock, indignation, and a flicker of something that might have been fear. They had orchestrated this entire scene to assert dominance, to remind me of my place, to put me in their debt, literally and figuratively. They never, in their wildest calculations, imagined that I would call their bluff, that I would accept their transactional view of our relationship and use it to purchase my own emancipation. My mother was the first to find her voice. "Elara, this is not what we—" "What?" I interrupted, my voice cold. "Not what you intended. You presented me with a bill for my life. I'm paying it. The transaction is complete." My father's face was flushed with anger. "This is disrespectful. This is not a game." "You're right," I said, meeting his glare without flinching. "It's not a game. It's a business deal. And it's done." I gestured to the check. "That clears your investment. From this moment forward, we have no further financial or emotional obligations to one another. You are no longer my parents. You are my creditors. And as of now, you are paid in full creditors." I turned my back on them. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out of the living room, through the foyer, and pulled open the heavy oak door. I stepped out into the cool night air, pulling the door shut behind me with a firm, resonant thud that felt more final than any spoken word. I didn't run. I walked down the manicured path to the waiting Uber I had preemptively called, a final act of defiance against their control. As the car pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back at the house. I looked forward at the road ahead. I had just paid $6,250 for my soul. It was the cheapest, most valuable thing I had ever bought. The cage door was open, and I was never, ever going back. The flight back to California was a surreal passage between two worlds. I was leaving the sterile, air-conditioned atmosphere of my past and returning to the warm, messy reality I had built for myself. I felt unmoored, existing in a strange limbo between shock and liberation. The immense, invisible weight I had carried my entire life, the weight of conditional approval, of the unspoken ledger, was gone. But in its place was a hollow, aching echo, the finality of what I had done beginning to resonate in the silence. When the plane landed, I powered on my phone with a sense of dread and grim curiosity. The screen lit up. No missed calls. No frantic texts. No lengthy emails full of recriminations or manufactured concern. Just the silent, digital confirmation of my new reality. The transaction was complete. They had accepted my payment. Ben was waiting for me at the airport. He didn't rush me with questions. He simply looked at my face, a pale canvas of exhaustion and stunned resolve, and opened his arms. I walked into his embrace, and the solid, steady feel of him finally broke the dam. I didn't weep hysterically. I cried quiet, shuddering tears that seemed to drain the last of the poison from my system. I told him everything, the words tumbling out in a raw, disjointed torrent. The summons, the strategic seating, the black folder, the itemized life, the cold, calculated total of $6,250, the check, and the single, powerful word I had written. Freedom. He listened, his arms a tight, safe circle around me. When I was finished, spent and hollowed out, he kissed my forehead and said, "You're free, Elara. You're finally free." The next few days were a blur. I moved through my final exams like an automaton, my body in California but my mind trapped in that sterile living room, replaying the scene on a continuous, painful loop. The initial shock began to morph, giving way to a deep, grieving anger. I wasn't angry at them, not in the way one might expect. I was angry at the years I had wasted, the energy I had expended trying to earn a love that was never on offer. I was angry for the little girl who had been taught that her worth was a number on a balance sheet. I was in mourning for the parents I never had, for the unconditional love I was never given, for the childhood that had been a performance. A week after my return, a mundane act became a moment of profound significance. I logged into my online banking, my heart thudding dully against my ribs. I had to know. I navigated to my account statement, my eyes scanning the transactions. And there it was, a clear check, number 201. Payee, Richard and Caroline Sterling. Amount, $6,250. Memo, freedom. They had cashed it. They had actually deposited the check into their account. I stared at the screen, a fresh wave of emotions crashing over me. There was a final, brutal pain in seeing the evidence. A last, definitive slam of a door I had already closed. It was the ultimate confirmation of their priorities. But, following closely behind, closely following, was an overwhelming, powerful sense of relief. This was no longer about my failings. It was about theirs. They had chosen $6,250 over a daughter. This realization, as painful as it was, felt like a final absolution. It was the proof I didn't know I needed that I had done the right thing. I knew then that I couldn't process this alone. The scars ran too deep. I made an appointment with a therapist at the University Counseling Center, a woman named Andrea with a calm demeanor and sharp, intelligent eyes. Our first session lasted 2 hours. I spilled the entire story, from the gilded cage of my childhood to the cold, hard numbers on the final invoice. "What you experienced," Andrea said, her voice steady and non-judgmental, "is a profound form of emotional abandonment, culminating in financial abandonment. They use the quantification of your life as a final tool of control and devaluation. But you reclaimed your power by turning their game into the instrument of your liberation. That check wasn't a debt you owed them, it was a debt you owed yourself." Her words were like a key turning in a locked door inside me. I wasn't broken, I was reorganizing. I was deconstructing the entire narrative of my life, not as a rejected daughter, but as a survivor of profound emotional manipulation. My relationship with Ben and his family deepened into something sturdier and more precious. Knowing the full truth, they surrounded me with a chaotic, noisy, unconditional love that was the antidote to my poison. Brenda, Ben's mother, would show up at our apartment with a pot of soup just because. Mark, his father, asked for my opinion on his investments, genuinely valuing my perspective. Their home became my sanctuary, a place where I was loved for my messy, authentic self, not for my performance. I started a journal, not a sweet, sentimental diary, but a raw, angry, and ultimately understanding ledger of my own. I wrote down every memory, every slight, every moment I had been forced to perform. I was exercising them from my system, putting them on paper, so I didn't have to carry them in my head anymore. I also gave myself permission to be angry. I screamed in the car with Ben, driving down empty highways with the windows rolled up. I took a kickboxing class and pummeled a heavy bag until my muscles burned and my knuckles were raw. I cried, not for the loss of the parents I had, but for the loss of the parents I deserved, for the child who was never allowed to simply be. The aftermath was not a linear process. It was messy and unpredictable. Some days, I felt powerful, invincible, like I had conquered a dragon. Other days, the old programming would kick in, and I would find myself seeking Ben's approval for minor decisions or over-apologizing for tiny mistakes. But now, I had the tools to recognize it. I could see the code, and I was working hard to rewrite it. The $6,250 check was no longer a bill of sale. It was my declaration of independence. The aftermath was painful, but it was the pain of healing, of metamorphosis. I was rebuilding myself from the ashes, and this time, I was the architect, building a foundation not of gold or glass, but of unshakable self-worth and authentic connection. As the initial shockwave subsided, a new phase began, the reckoning. This wasn't about them anymore, it was about me. It was about staring into the abyss of my own past and deciding what to build from the wreckage. Therapy with Andrea became my anchor. We delved deep, not just into the final bill, but into a lifetime of micro-rejections that had shaped me. "Let's talk about the narrative," Andrea said one session. "The chosen one story. How did that make you feel as a child?" "It made me feel special," I said, then paused, reconsidering. "But it also made me feel responsible. Like I had to be perpetually worthy of being chosen. Like my value was conditional on my performance." "Exactly," she nodded. "It was a narrative of conditional love from the very beginning. You weren't just loved, you were loved because you were chosen, and that choice could presumably be unmade. The bill was simply the final, explicit unmaking. This reframing was revolutionary. I hadn't been a difficult child. I had been a child trying to survive in an emotionally barren environment. The doubt, the anxiety, the perfectionism, they weren't character flaws. They were coping mechanisms. I started to experiment with my newfound freedom in small ways. I changed my major from art history to psychology, a decision that would have horrified my parents. I did it because I was fascinated by the human mind, by trauma and resilience. I wanted to understand what had happened to me so I could help others. It was the most authentic academic choice I had ever made. I also made a conscious effort to build my own family, my circle. It consisted of Ben, of course, and Maya, my roommate. It included a few other close friends who had proven themselves kind and loyal. And it included Ben's family, who had officially adopted me in every way that mattered. His mother, Brenda, would call me just to chat. His father, Mark, asked for my help building a website for his local Rotary Club. These were simple, mundane acts of inclusion, but to me, they were profound. One weekend, we were all at Ben's family house for a barbecue. The scene was its usual beautiful chaos. Kids were running through sprinklers, the grill was smoking, music was playing. Brenda was handing me a plate of potato salad to put on the table when she gently touched my arm. "You know, Elara," she said, her voice soft. "Family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you build. And you're a part of ours, for as long as you want to be." Tears welled up in my eyes, but they were warm, healing tears. No one had ever said anything like that to me. It was an offer with no strings, no ledger, no conditions. I just nodded, unable to speak, and gave her a quick, tight hug. This was what I had been missing. This sense of belonging that came from who you are, not from what you provide or represent. It was messy, it was loud, and it was real. Meanwhile, the legal and practical aspects of my separation from the Sterlings began. A week after the check cleared, a large cardboard box arrived via courier at my apartment. My heart leaped into my throat. It was from their address. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were all the things I had left in my suite. My childhood journals, a few books, some photo albums. There was no note. It was a final, symbolic severance. They were cleaning out my room, closing the books on the Elara Sterling project. As I flipped through a photo album, I saw the curated history of my life. Me in beautiful dresses at parties, me standing stiffly beside my parents on vacations, me smiling a tight, practiced smile. I didn't look like a happy child. I looked like a well-dressed mannequin. I closed the album. I didn't need these anymore. I took the box and stored it in the back of my closet. It was part of my past, but it didn't define my future. The reckoning was also about forgiveness, but not in the way people often think. Andrea taught me that forgiveness isn't about condoning what someone did. It's about releasing yourself from the prison of your own anger. I couldn't carry the weight of what they had done for the rest of my life. It would only poison me. So, I worked on forgiving them. I forgave them for their profound emotional limitations. I forgave them for being unable to love me in the way I needed. And most importantly, I forgave myself for not being enough, for not seeing the truth sooner, for all the years I spent trying to earn what was never mine to have. It was a long, difficult process, but with each passing week, I felt stronger, more solid. The foundation of my new life wasn't built on gold or glass. It was built on authenticity, on chosen connections, on the hard-won knowledge of my own worth. The reckoning wasn't an end, it was the beginning of my true life. A year passed. The sharp edges of the pain had softened, sanded down by time, therapy, and love. I was thriving in my psychology program. My grades were excellent because I was genuinely passionate about the material. Ben and I moved into a small, sunny apartment together. A space filled with our shared books, his guitar in the corner, and photos of us with our circle. Pictures filled with genuine, laughing smiles. The $6,250 check had long since faded from my daily thoughts. It had become a story I told, a foundational myth of my own creation, but one of empowerment, not victimhood. One afternoon, I was cleaning out a drawer when I found the carbon copy of the check. I stared at the word, freedom, scrawled in my own handwriting. An idea sparked, one that felt both terrifying and right. I went to a craft store and bought a simple, sleek shadow box. I placed the check carbon in the center, a stark, white rectangle against the black backing. Below it, on a small, typed card, I wrote, "The cost of my soul, $6,250. The value of my freedom, priceless. This is not a receipt of debt paid. It is a declaration of independence claimed." I hung it on the wall in my home office. It wasn't a trophy of pain. It was a monument to my resilience. It was a reminder that I had walked through fire and emerged, not burned, but forged into something stronger. My relationship with Ben deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. He had seen me at my most broken and had never flinched. He loved me not in spite of my messy, complicated past, but as a whole person who contained that history. We talked about the future, real futures, built on shared dreams, not dynastic expectations. We wanted a home filled with noise and laughter, a family where love was given freely, without a hidden price tag. One evening, we were over at Ben's parents' house for dinner. The conversation turned to my studies, and I found myself passionately explaining a concept about post-traumatic growth. Brenda listened intently, then said, "I'm so proud of you, Elara. The woman you've become. You're incredible." The word proud landed differently now. It didn't feel like an evaluation. It felt like an acknowledgement. It was the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I had found the unconditional love and approval I had spent a lifetime searching for. It just hadn't come from the people I originally expected it from. The true inheritance from Richard and Caroline Sterling wasn't the trust fund I had been disinvited from, nor was it the trauma they had inflicted. My true inheritance was the profound, diamond-hard knowledge of my own worth. It was the ability to discern genuine love from transactional performance. It was the resilience to build a beautiful life from the broken pieces they had left me. I had inherited myself, and that was the only fortune I would ever need. The story of the $6,250 bill was no longer a story about betrayal. It was my origin story. It was the crucible that taught me the most valuable lesson I would ever learn, that family isn't a ledger of debts and credits. It's a sanctuary you build, stone by stone, with the people who see you, love you, and choose you every single day without ever presenting a bill. And that is the tale of how a $6 $2.50 bill for being adopted became the key to a woman's true inheritance, self-worth, freedom, and the courage to build a family of her own. The shock was the catalyst, but the choice to walk away and define her own value was the victory. If this story of resilience resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in her situation? And if you have a family secret that needs a voice, remember, this channel is a sanctuary for the truths that set us free. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more journeys into the shocking, healing secrets that make us human. Until next time, remember, your worth is never, ever for sale. The plane touched down in California, and the very air felt different. It was lighter, warmer, scented with salt and eucalyptus instead of polish and anxiety. My new life began not with a fanfare, but with a deep, cleansing breath I felt I hadn't taken in 18 years. The college campus was a vibrant, chaotic, gloriously messy paradise. There were no Persian rugs to swallow sound. Instead, there was the constant hum of conversation, laughter, and music drifting from open dorm windows. There were no crystal trinkets, just faded band posters and string lights. For the first few months, I felt like a zoo animal released into the wild. I was disoriented, skittish, and unaccustomed to the lack of walls. My dorm room, shared with a perpetually cheerful girl from Oregon named Maya, was a tenth the size of my suite at home and 1,000 times more alive. Clothes were strewn about, half-empty mugs of tea sat on desks, and the air was thick with the smell of popcorn and nail polish. It was glorious. The distance from my parents was a miracle cure for my soul. The weekly phone calls were brief, formal affairs. "Are your grades acceptable?" my father would ask. "Do you need any funds?" my mother would inquire. There was no "Do you have friends?" or "Are you happy?" The script was familiar, and now, from 3,000 miles away, it lost its power to wound me as deeply. I could play my part, the responsible, grateful daughter, and then hang up and return to my real life. I deliberately shed the skin of Elara Sterling, the adopted daughter of Richard and Caroline. I introduced myself simply as Elara. I made friends who liked me for my terrible, enthusiastic dance moves in our dorm room, for my loud, unrefined laugh, for my willingness to pull all-nighters talking about philosophy and life. They knew nothing of my family's wealth, and I guarded that information fiercely. I wanted to be loved for my messy, authentic self, not for my potential as a social connection or a reflection of someone else's generosity. And then there was Ben. I met him in my introduction to journalism class. He wasn't like anyone I had ever known. He was all warm, steady energy and genuine curiosity. He wore faded band t-shirts and jeans, and his smile was easy and frequent. He wasn't impressed by status or wealth. He was interested in stories, in people and truth. Our first conversation was about the ethics of documentary filmmaking, and I found myself talking with a passion I didn't know I possessed. He listened, truly listened, his brown eyes focused and kind. Falling in love with Ben was like learning a new, beautiful language. It was a language of touch, of holding hands just because, of casual hugs that lasted a little too long, of his arms slung comfortably around my shoulders. It was a language of words, of "I'm proud of you," spoken with genuine feeling, of "You look beautiful," whispered when I had a cold and was wrapped in a blanket, of "Tell me what you're thinking," and actually wanting to know. A few months into our relationship, he invited me home for Thanksgiving. I was nervous. Meeting the family was a big deal, and my only frame of reference was the Sterling family, a prospect that filled me with dread. Ben's family lived in a sprawling, slightly ramshackle house in a suburb of San Diego. The moment I walked in, I was assaulted by a wave of sound and smell. The television was on, someone was playing the guitar in the living room, and 2 golden retrievers barreled into us, tails wagging furiously. The air was thick with the scent of roasting turkey, pumpkin pie, and dog. His family was a revelation. His mother, a warm, flower-dusted woman, pulled me into a hug that was all softness and genuine welcome. "So you're the Elara Ben won't stop talking about," she said, her eyes crinkling. His father shook my hand firmly and immediately launched into a story about his own college days. His younger sister interrogated me about my music taste with the brutal honesty of a teenager. They argued over the football game, they teased each other mercilessly, they laughed until they cried. And they included me in all of it. I watched them, mesmerized. This was what a family was supposed to be. It was loud, it was messy, it was imperfect, and it was overflowing with a love that was unconditional, a love that asked for nothing in return. They didn't share just DNA, they shared a life. Being with them was a healing balm on wounds I hadn't even fully acknowledged. It highlighted the sterile, performative, transactional nature of my own upbringing in stark, painful, and ultimately liberating contrast. My visits back to the East Coast, to the Gilded Cage, became even shorter, more strategic performances. I was a ghost in my own home, going through the motions, saying the right things, smiling the right smile. But now I had a secret power. I had a touchstone. I knew what real love felt like. I would count down the hours until I could return to my real life, to Ben, to the messy, beautiful chaos that was my chosen family. I thought I had found a perfect balance. I could manage the two worlds, the cold, transactional one of my past and the warm, authentic one of my present. I was an expert navigator, but I was naive. I had mistaken a temporary ceasefire for a permanent peace. The foundation I had thought was solid ice was, in reality, a frozen lake, and the spring thaw was coming. The cracks were about to widen into a chasm, and the fall would be more devastating than I could ever have imagined.